the PS, the Vice Chancellor, Walid, the UNDP Res Rep, Hubert Pear, my colleagues from the UN family, ladies and gentlemen. So let me tell you a little story. So there was this young boy who was called X, let's call him X, and he came from a community in India which got partitioned. As you know, in 1947, India was partitioned into 3 countries, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. So when the partition happened, particular people of religious faiths had to migrate one way or the other because that is what the partition was premised on. It was based on religion. So the family, which had a reasonably middle-class income, lost everything and had to flee because there was an outbreak of violence. In fact, those of you who study history would probably understand that 1947 was perhaps one of the biggest genocides that happened in the Indian subcontinent. Over 2 million people were killed at that time. It was just a decision that was taken by Mahatma Gandhi that, okay, let India be partitioned, and that one decision impacted the lives of millions and millions of people. So anyway, this family fled and came into India and had to start from scratch. I mean, really scratch. When you have, it's a different thing when you go from impoverishment to another impoverishment. But it's a very different thing when you come from reasonable endowments to nothing. And that starts a whole cycle of life, which is in a very different trajectory. And then what happened was this family had children, and you can imagine what the circumstance was. The living conditions were not ideal. And one of the children actually ended up getting polio. And, fortunately, it was caught at the right time. But what the family chose to do was to actually keep the number of children to the bare minimum that they wanted to have. And that was because the woman in the household was, the wife was educated, the husband was educated. So they realized that by having a large number of children, which is what India does, is produce large number of children because it's also a lottery. They don't know how many will survive. It is that, and it's like the roll of a dice. So I'm going back to what Walid talked about. It is about circumstance, choice, and opportunity. Those are the decisions that make and break us. Just at that moment, it just so happened that that child, the doctor noticed something odd, and the child was taken to a hospital, and at the age of 3, they used to use these electrical shocks to correct the posture, and things got right. But because the family kept itself subtle and small and supple, they were able to invest in their children. And as a result of which, they were able to push, and those choices and the opportunities and the circumstance push their children up the median ladder. So that child that got polio is me. And I stand today as a resident coordinator in a country where this is not part of the plan at all. But it was choice, opportunity, and circumstance that redefined everything that happens. So, when I have an 8-year-old son, and when I go to Eastleigh or I go past to this Gothongoro area and all that, I realize, and I look at my boy who's 8 years old, and I realize, look at his start in life, whereas there is another child over there who's quite like me at my starting point. And just look at where the differentials are. So this is where I believe the power of public policy comes into play. It is about equity, it is about equality, and how that transforms. If you look at post-Second World War Europe and the advent of the Marshall Plan, good governance, a focus on good health and education is what brought human capital up. If you look at the story of the Asian tigers, very similar. An investment in good health outcomes and good education outcomes created a human capital which started to have a catalytic effect. Why is India not called an Asian tiger, or Philippines called an Asian tiger? Did you ever think about that? It's because there were certain countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, which really looked at their human capital from a real sense of the word, from a human development perspective. And that became the transformation angle, because that is what they invested in, to be able to bring in a human capital where family sizes were small, they were able to reap a demographic dividend. Now, as they've aged, they've gone rich before they've got old. And we are at a median age of 18. What we do now will define the trajectory of Kenya's population over the next 10 to 15 years. In fact, when I say that Kenya is a beacon of hope, I mean that in every sense of the word. I was here in 2016 as the UNDP RR. I just stepped into that role when the Human Development Report for Africa was launched in Nairobi. 26th of August. That day is replete in my memory. President Uhuru Kenyatta and the former administrator of UNDP, Helen Clark, launched that report. And it is very much symbiotic to this report which is being launched today. It was about accelerating gender equality and women's empowerment. Did you know that $95 billion is lost year on year in sub-Saharan Africa because of inequality? And simple things like 50% of that population not being in the workforce, 50% of that population not being productive, 50% of that population being held back into a state of dependency, 50% of the population being turned into broodmares where they just have to produce endless number of children because that is what the cultural norm is. But it's not necessarily that. It is like the roll of a dice. They don't know how many will survive. How many will survive childbirth? How many will survive the first 5 years of life? And therefore, it goes back to something which is very important that this country has done, which is on the primacy of universal health coverage. You have no idea how important that is fundamentally, the preventative style. Today, 1 million young people join the workforce in Kenya every year. 1 million. Age group 15 to 26. There are 3,000 Kenyans born every day. The age group of 15 to 26, that's what joins the workforce. Out of that, 20% are unemployable. Do you know why? Because from the time of conception, they have been at a disadvantage. Their mothers were undernourished. They had, iron deficiencies. They were anemic. They were young, so they were already having repeated pregnancies. So what started to happen was these children in the womb started to already get stunted. So by the time the child has come, and the first 1,000 days of life with the absence of micronutrients, what is happening? You've got all the vaccines and all that coming up, so the child is surviving. But the child is surviving stunted and is surviving without the neural pathways of their intellectual acumen well developed. So as a result, what they become is they get into a state of dependency on these societies. Now, mind you, for them, a lot of them become actually the foot soldiers that go and join the Al-Shabaab or other violent extremist groups because there are no choices in front of them. And it is those absence of choices. So I go back to what I was talking about was choices, opportunities, and circumstance. So I think the timing of this report becomes even more clear because I would want this report to now inform a lot of our own work in the UN Development Assistance Framework, which as it is focused towards what Kenya, as a leader of the SDGs, together with Ireland and Hungary, as part of the Open Working Group, gave the world the SDGs. How many people at the back knew that? That Kenya is a country that actually gave the SDGs to the rest of the world. Your ambassador Macharia was the person who was negotiating this day on, day in, day out in New York to make it happen. And the SDGs responds to Vision 2030 about equality. The Vision 2030 is about equality in Kenya. And that is what the SDGs has embraced. So to us, it is a crucial aspect that this report is being launched here, because I firmly believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we could, if we get it right in Kenya, we would create a blueprint for the rest of Africa. Thank you.